Welcome to the latest upload from my video series Bootcamp for Saints, where, among other things, I explore the various parts of the Gospel of Mark, which is organized along with the signs of the Zodiac. Now we're in Taurus. Use it or lose it is the old saying that fits very well in Taurus, but there's a newer, cooler one. You better work. Yes, Mama. From The Gospel and the Zodiac by the Reverend Bill Darlison. I basically use this as a textbook in this series. As Aries symbolizes the sprouting seed struggling for life amidst the forces of decay, so Taurus represents the next stage of the process, establishing roots which will supply nourishment to the growing plant. After the primary impulse of the cardinal sign comes the crystallization of fixity. Symbolically, the raw energies of Aries are collected, shaped, and given direction in Taurus. The momentum is slowed and practical issues have to be faced. This is a natural process of development for any activity. The force of the initial impulse is often tremendous, but it lacks effectiveness until it has encountered the real world of experience. Indeed, that initial force is tremendous. As I said in the video on Aries, you're more Catholic than the Pope. I remember one time my grandma was asking her daughter, Aunt Johnny Lee, about her own daughter who'd been married just a few months before. Are they still living on love? Johnny Lee was quick. No, they're taking out the trash. You like that name, Johnny Lee? That's a good old Southern girl's name. It's in Taurus that we start to take out the trash of our day-to-day Christian living. And it is a drag, and not a fun drag like RuPaul. Jesus said, don't take it personally, but do not blow off this work. The devil rules the world and he hates Jesus. So in the best case scenario, your faith is just going to slowly corrode and disappear over time. But the reality is demonic forces control every single aspect of our entertainment industry, and they're constantly bullying you into leaving Christianity. In the Zodiac, Taurus is the physical world. It is represented preeminently by farmers and farming, which is why virtually every conversation and parable about farmers and farming in the Gospel of Mark happened in Taurus. But wait, there's more. For the mystic, the material world is neither an idol to be worshipped nor a distraction to be despised. It is instead the very vehicle of our enlightenment. In the words of Gerard Manley Hopkins, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It's going to be important later. Hopkins' fellow Jesuit Teilhard de Chardin echoes these sentiments. Throughout my whole life, during every moment I have lived, the world has gradually been taking on light and fire for me, until it has come to envelop me in one mass of luminosity, flaming from within. The light which breaks through the material world and leads us to enlightenment provides the mystical connection between Taurus and light, but there is a more obvious and astronomical one. In and around the constellation are some of the most spectacular sights in the night sky. It should not surprise you from what I've just read that Taurus is also associated with light. The constellation Orion is a deacon of Taurus. There are 36 such deacons associated with the various zodiacal signs, and Mark refers to most of them. Orion is just about the brightest constellation in the sky, probably other than the Big Dipper. And with the Big Dipper, it's virtually the only one you could see through the visual pollution of city lights at night. Ptolemy called the eye of the bull, normally called Aldebaran, he called it Lampadius, the lamp, the torch, actually. Off Taurus's shoulder is the very important constellation of the Pleiades, which told farmers when they should plant. There's your farmers again. The Seven Sisters. In the early poems of Gilgamesh, where he's called Bilgames, it's 7 brothers. The Pleiades is the only constellation in the sky with an invisible member. The seventh sister, Merope, is so faint that a lot of times you just can't even see her. And about 200 years before Jesus was born, Eratosthenes of Cyrenaica in modern-day Libya called her Panaphanes. Phanes is visible, aphanes is not visible. Like typical is typical and atypical is not typical. Pan is the Greek word for all, so Panaphanes. Okay. There's a huge colony of Jews in Cyrenaica. In fact, when the Bible was being written, the Kitos War was going on. And during that war, the Jews exterminated virtually the entire population of Cyrenaica. After the war was over, the Romans had to bring in settlers to repopulate the cities. They had killed so many people in Cyprus that for the next 500 years, if any Jew set foot on the island, he was immediately executed. Eratosthenes, in turn, was a very big deal. He was a chief librarian of the Library of Alexandria. He invented geography. And as a geographer, he correctly calculated the size of the Earth's circumference and the tilt of the Earth's axis. So yes, Mark's audience knew Eratosthenes. Venus is the light bearer. I think she's the brightest planet in the sky. I remember one time I was coming out of a grocery store and I was in a parking lot and a woman was pointing at Venus and yelling, "It's a UFO." I mean, Venus was so bright and so low. Venus rules Taurus. There's your light again. All of this is in Mark 4, 1 through 34. Yes, Taurus represents the world and its filthy lucre. There's a reason why we have the bull market on Wall Street. But hidden in the world is a divine spark that, when rattled, can come bursting forth, just like the shining foil in the quote. Now, for the past few years, I've been trying to answer the question of whether or not the Jews, the Israelites really, were monotheists. You think the answer is obvious. Surely they were. But the Bible hints that they weren't. They were told they couldn't put any gods before Yahweh, implying there were other gods. Also, the archaeological record of Bible times Israel is full of female figurines. Surely these are goddesses. I've also discovered wordplay in the Hebrew that indicates some manner of contact between Yahweh, who's a soldier and a storm god, and the mother goddess Asherah, perhaps even a direct identification. The big one is the divine revelation of the name to Moses. Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I am that I am. Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I am Asherah. Okay, keep that in mind. Now, thanks to the work of the translator Michael Heiser over at Logos Software, I know that Yahweh's rival gods were real, or at least the Bible treats them as real. So the question was, did the Israelites actually worship any of these gods? Maybe secondarily to Yahweh, but nevertheless. My original opinion is they were monotheists. Then recently I switched to polytheist because I thought they worshipped Asherah as well as Yahweh. But now I'm back to monotheism, with a twist. A twist with a twist. And wouldn't you know, Taurus is the perfect video to roll out my harebrained new theory. It starts with this verse, Deuteronomy 23:17. As you can see on the right, the King James Bible tells us a double lie about this passage. Even though every single man in Sodom was trying to join in on a gang rape of strangers who turned out to be angels, so you're screwed now. Were they all homosexuals? Then it was lying when it said that this passage tells us that homosexuals were not to be tolerated among the men of Israel. But look at the words, Kadeshah for women and Kadesh for men. This is the root of the Hebrew word for holy. So whatever they are, they're male and female versions of the same thing. Another thing, Asherah is also called Kadesh, and this goddess is the patron of these sacred prostitutes in the Middle East. Asherah, Ishtar, and Nana. Depends on where you are. Of course, that begs the question, why did the Israelites have sacred prostitutes? Why did any of these people? Well, if you've been watching my videos, you know I spend a lot of time using the Hellenistic Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, to see if it differs from the Hebrew text that we have now, and if it does differ, to try to figure out why. Well, for some reason, I never looked up this verse, even though I've done it dozens of times. In fact, I kept reminding myself over and over again, don't forget to look up that Deuteronomy verse in the Septuagint, and then I would forget. Well, I mean, it's just one line. How different can it be, right? Well, I was in for a surprise. A very good one. The Septuagint is adding a second line, so the Greek is twice as long. Basically, it repeats itself. Let there be no whatever among the daughters of Israel. Let there be no whatever among the sons of Israel. The first is the porne-porneuen parallel we expect. Porn, pornography, male and female prostitutes. But not just any run-of-the-mill gutter prostitutes. And a Greek reader who doesn't understand Hebrew might think that. To clear up the ambiguity, the Septuagint adds the second line. The paired words there are telesphoros and teleskomenos, which in the latest translation of the Septuagint into English is rendered as initiates in both cases. Aha! The riddle is solved. When they think about sacred prostitutes, scholars think in terms of fertility rites. But talk of initiates tells me we should start thinking about a mystery tradition, which in turn gets me to thinking about syzygies. Because maybe, just maybe, the God of Israel was a syzygy. That's a twin pair of oppositions. The plus and minus pole of a battery is a syzygy. So the male and female prostitutes might represent the two faces of the same God. Now that might be a step too far, as I'll show you, but let's play with it, because it can be very helpful, and also because it's very Jungian. And I love C.G. Jung, and I love bringing him in any chance that I got. Let me explain. If you've heard of either an anima or an animus, you've heard something of C.G. Jung. For women, the focus of the unconscious is the masculine animus, and for men, the focus of the unconscious is the feminine anima. So if an opposite sex character shows up in your dream, it's probably your animus or anima, even if you're gay or lesbian. Typically, you live out your youth as the sex you're born with. Classically, that meant a man gets a job and gets married and leads a household. The woman has the children and raises the children and maintains the household. But when you reach a certain age, it's time to dive into the unconscious. And to do that, you must live out your animus or anima. You'll probably want to get the ball rolling on that about the time your youngest is taking his SATs, maybe a little before. Together, the male and the female are syzygies. So we can pencil in the God of Israel as something like the Roman god Janus, who, perhaps coincidentally, but perhaps not, has a name that sounds a lot like Yahweh. Most of us think the king of the Roman gods is Jupiter, but there's a very good chance this could actually be the greatest of their gods. Janus, in turn, is paired with Yana. So just like Kadishah and Kaddish and Porne and Pornuen, we have a pair of synced up names, and they were synced up on purpose. Yana is Diana, so they went out of their way to do this. Although, for the sake of full disclosure, the goddess pictured here is actually Minerva. Now, according to the Roman antiquarian Macrobius Ambrosius Theodosius, Janus is properly understood to be Apollo, which is perfect, because this just confirms to me that before they called themselves Romans, the people who lived on the 7 hills of the Tiber called themselves the Captor. You might know them as the Minoans. And this two-faced axe is one of the most decisive signals from the Bronze Age that you are dealing with Captor. The two faces of the Roman deity and the axe is one coincidence. Here's the other. As I've discussed several times in other videos, the two faces of the axe represent the two faces of the sun, just as Janus is Apollo. One face faces us as it circles overhead, but after that it descends under our feet into the underworld, and it shows its other face there. This is just one of many, many explicit connections I've made between the Romans and the Minoans. There is no way these are not the same people, plus or minus, of course, the people who moved in and out of the territory after the fall of the Minoans in 1450 BC. Here's another. They call themselves the Captor. By unanimous agreement, the first hill the Romans landed on was Capitol Hill. I don't think they called it Capitol Hill. I think they called it Captor Hill. I think they named it after themselves. This same parallelism shows up in Akkadian, the language spoken in Babylon, Khezru and Khazertu. Did they have a syzygy or mystery tradition too? If not, then admittedly that would undermine my case, so obviously I've still got a lot of work to do. I mean, as I said, calling Yahweh a syzygy might be half a step too far, but just a half. So, continuing with the paradigm. In the case of Yahweh, I would suggest on the one hand we have the soldier storm god. Here it's Baal, Yahweh's counterpart and rival in the Old Testament. The conflict came to a head during the time of the prophet Elijah. On the other end of this social civil war, you have King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Whenever you see the warrior Yahweh riding a cloud in the Bible, that image is drawn from northern Syria and Baal Hadad, Lord Hadad. And it carries on to this day in Christianity. In fact, when Jesus declared to the chief priests that he'd be returning on clouds of glory, he'd admitted that he thought he was Yahweh. That's why the priest tore his clothing and called him a blasphemer. So, what's the other face of Yahweh? A goddess? Asherah? Not exactly. Here we see a late Minoan fresco that was created in the decades leading into the Exodus from Egypt. During their late and last period, the Minoans suddenly started creating images of vegetation and animals. Riotous images of animals mixing in from the sea and the land and the air, plants sprouting different species of flowers. Most people thought these were homages to the mother goddess. Except there never was a goddess anywhere. There was none to be found. I think the goddess was sublimated, and I think the Israelites followed up on that. I think she was sublimated by being folded into the person of Yahweh. The Bible, for example, speaks of Asherim that are associated with Yahweh. Well, that's a plural. Sounds like Asherah, except it's masculine. But on the other hand, in the northern kingdom of Israel, what we see in the archaeological record is something about Yahweh and his Asherah. And then, of course, there are all those female figurines that I talked about. And in the struggle between Yahweh and Baal on Mount Carmel, through his prophet Elijah, this is happening in the northern kingdom of Israel. 450 prophets of Baal were executed on the spot after Baal's rout, but there were also 400 prophets of Asherah present. They were left unmolested. Why were they even there? Because Asherah was either the consort of Baal or Yahweh. And while leading into the conflict, Baal seems to have had the upper hand. After the conflict, it was game over. So we might have a lot of play to be had here. We could be looking at a syzygy weighted in favor of Yahweh, which would have resulted in its collapse, which would have resulted in Yahweh absorbing Asherah, but not completely. She still pokes her head out every once in a while as woman wisdom. But even then, as I've shown, Jesus takes up all of her attributes in the New Testament. So if I'm right, that means the New Testament just picked up where the Old Testament left off, which is what we've been telling the Jews for 2,000 years. But how does that leave room for a Queen Asherah alongside King Yahweh? So maybe in the north it's some kind of heresy. So however this played out, there's divinity embedded in the world, and the Bible acknowledges that, which is why I bring this whole thing up in the Taurus video. Now, Texas is full of very violent thunderstorms, and they're often accompanied by tornadoes. Dallas is in Tornado Alley. And they can be very violent and scary if you get caught up in one jogging in the middle of the afternoon, like happened to me one time. They shake the walls and rattle the windows and scare the hell out of your dogs. Yahweh. But after a storm, there's a sudden explosion of growth. The trees and the grass get greener before your eyes. The flowers really open up. Asherah. And how did Yahweh break forth her shining light? By rattling the world, just like you see that shaken foil in the quote. Let's bring it into the bedroom. Have we not all learned that the best sex is makeup sex after you've had a fight? I wonder how many babies came from makeup sex. There's your fertility for you, Papa. I covered this paper in a previous video, The Origins of Yahweh in Light of the Earliest Psalms. Reinhard Muller's got a nice little translation of Psalm 29 that I think he's getting right and everybody else is getting wrong. It perfectly captures the glory of a Texas thunderstorm, the glory of our Yahweh, and as Asherah. The voice of Yahweh is over the waters. Yahweh is over great waters. The voice of Yahweh is powerful. The voice of Yahweh is full of majesty. The voice of Yahweh breaks cedars. The voice of Yahweh cleaves flames of fire. The voice of Yahweh causes wilderness to go into labor. Yahweh causes holy wilderness to go into labor. The voice of Yahweh causes hinds to calve and causes chamois to give birth quickly. Notice Yahweh causes holy wilderness to go into labor. Holy is Kaddish. That's Asherah. That's why I like his translation. Scholars keep thinking there's a wilderness called Kaddish and they just don't know where it is. But that's not its name. That's what it is. The divine Yahweh as Kaddish embedded in the world. If that turns out to be right, then the ideology of Psalm 21 is a spot-on match for the ideology that we see in those late Minoan frescoes. This is a splendid psalm. I love yelling it out at the top of my lungs in the middle of a Texas thunderstorm. I think that's what it's made for. My hand to God, it is the most cathartic thing. It's like you're dancing with fire. Now, as I said, Yahweh seems to signal some kind of equivalence with Asherah. And if you put that alongside the subtle punning you see in the Bible, whenever the Bible talks about these prostitutes, I think we've got a very strong case of an unbalanced syzygy. Here we see Yahweh's revelation to Moses. He's built a tower reaching to heaven. They used to build things with words. I've even seen a spiral and a braid. At the apex is his manifestation as Yahweh the thunder god, but in the foundation you see him as Asherah, firmly embedded in the material world, which is represented by Taurus. Here's the law that's supposed to give the death penalty to gay men. It's telling you that it is a ritual abomination, that's a ritual term, for a man to lie with male beds of Asha. So when they say lie with a man as with a woman, giving an interpretation and folding it into the scripture and throwing it in your face and telling you that proves that God's anti-gay. Also, they're telling you that that ritual term can also apply to sexual abomination. That's bullshit. There's a large gap between ritual space and profane space. It's well understood in this culture. The wordplay here strongly indicates we're looking at a pun on Asherah. I'm going to read it. The part that's highlighted, I'm going to hack it to bits. But Uaish Asher Ishkbe Ath Zucker Mishkbi Asher Tuobe Oshu. Here we're going to see even more of the punning. But notice how the house of the male prostitutes is laid parallel to the house of Yahweh. This confirms my position that in the mystery ritual involved, these prostitutes stood for the storm god. Athbethi Ekedeshem, Asher Bebith, Yehweh Asher, and carries on, Arguth Shem Bethim Lashra. Now notice how Yehweh Asher very nicely echoes the original Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh in Yahweh's revelation. And of course our Kadeshah Kadesh binary. Once again, Asherah is also called Kadesh. Now let's get back to Taurus, which once again represents the world. As Christians, we should think of Taurus as a canoe. Don't tip it over. Either way is just as bad. You can slip into gross materialism and make the world your god, here represented by our Wall Street bull. Or you can tip over in the opposite direction into pantheism. Yes, God's power is embedded in the world, but he isn't the world itself, and the world is not God. And neither are you. And now it's time for sacred script. We don't have a lot in Taurus because it's less than a chapter long, so it's short, but deep. And I learned a very important lesson while I was preparing for this video. We're going to start with one of Jesus' more famous parables. Hear this. A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it had little soil. It sprang up at once because the soil was not deep. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and it withered for lack of roots. Some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it produced no grain. And some seed fell on rich soil and produced fruit. It came up and grew and yielded 30, 60, and 100-fold. Added, whoever has ears to hear ought to hear. So, as a Christian, how much do you think you are yielding? Unsaid but entirely possible is a man being saved but entering heaven empty-handed. But it's a very bad idea to go into this with the mentality of doing just enough to get by. To use Catholic terminology, don't just aim to avoid the mortal sins. Work on your venial sins. That way your mortal sins will take care of themselves. You'll beat off the attempt of the devil and the world to rob you of your salvation, and your rewards in heaven will be greater. For just as there are varying degrees of agony in hell, there are varying degrees of joy in heaven. And remember, once again, the powers who rule this world hate Jesus, and you must be actively cementing your relationship with him, because they are certainly actively working to corrode that relationship. Okay? Now, the next quote is where my new learning started. He also told them, take care what you hear. The measure with which you measure will be measured out to you, and still more will be given to you. To the one who has, more will be given. To the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Two things here. First, as I said in a previous quote, you need to be very careful about your standards as a Christian. You keep splashing down there in the shallows, not building up any real merit, and you might end up just losing the whole game. Jesus spits lukewarm Christians out of his mouth. Secondly, as Jesus said here, I knew that you were rewarded far beyond the evident merits of your works, although you were not saved by your works. But until I did research for this video, I had a very crude transactional idea of how this worked. It's like Jesus was saying, for every dollar you invest in the kingdom of heaven, I will provide a $10 matching grant. Now, the very next verse corrects me on that. He said, this is how it is with the kingdom of God. It is as if a man were to scatter seed on the land and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He knows not how. Of its own accord, the land yields fruit. First the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. And when the grain is ripe, he wields a sickle at once, for the harvest has come. So a better metaphor would be, for every dollar in seed you plant in the kingdom of heaven, you reap $10 in spiritual produce. Produce that never spoils and eternally renews itself. That makes more spiritual sense. He said, to what shall we compare the kingdom of God, or what parable can we use for it? It is like a mustard seed that, when it is sown in the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on the earth. But once it is sown, it springs up and becomes the largest of plants, and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the sky can dwell in its shade. With many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to understand it. If you're going to do anything with your eternal rewards in heaven while you're on earth, you're going to underestimate them. But you must stand firm, otherwise you'll never get them. Final quote, and shift in gears. We know that the bull of heaven is associated with light, and we know about the Pleiades. Mark worked this into the Taurus section, and he was being very clever about it too. He said to them, Is a lamp brought in to be placed under a bushel basket or under a bed, and not to be placed on a lampstand? For there is nothing hidden except to be made visible. Nothing is secret except to come to light. Anyone who has ears to hear ought to hear. You have to see the Greek to see it. Let me show you. Made visible is phanerothe. Come to light is phaneron. These two are directly connected to Eratosthenes' Panophanes, all invisible. So Mark is telling us, don't be a Panophanes, be a Phanes. See how awesome it is to be a Christian? Amen. I responded to a viewer of one of my last videos who could not believe that Mark's gospel was so carefully constructed, because the Greek of the gospel is awful. It's gutter Greek. Scholars hold their noses when they're reading it. But of the four gospels, architecturally speaking, Mark's is without peer in terms of careful, intricate construction. And I'm not even talking about the fact that at the same time he's doing all of this, he's playing literary games with Homer. He's deconstructing and one-upping the Iliad and the Odyssey. I guarantee you, in his day-to-day life, Mark spoke gorgeous Greek. Thank you very much. So now we come to the end of Taurus. I will see you next in Gemini. And remember, you better work.